I can hear the kind of conversations among the MPs, kind of starting mentioning nuclear option much more often than before. So I presume this is really a no-brainer.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today we're talking to Professor Vlad Mykhnenko. Now, Professor Mykhnenko is the Professor of Geography and Political Economy in the University of Oxford and a research fellow in sustainable urban development at St. Peter's College in Oxford, and an old friend of Frontline. Vlad, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you, Philip. Happy to be back.
There's nothing going on in the world, so I don't know what we're going to talk about. No, I'm joking. The Middle East. With what's happening in the Middle East, Ukraine seems to have virtually disappeared from wider commentary around the world. So that people can be brought up to speed, what's going on in Ukraine that you're aware of today that we need to make people aware of?
So last night, Ukraine has suffered, especially Kyiv, has suffered the heaviest bombardment ever. I'm afraid to say that anytime I comment on these night attacks, they're becoming heaviest ever. So a lot of damage has been caused by these new modernized Russian Iranian drones, Shahid drones. Also quite a lot of cruise missiles and also ballistic missiles. We've seen a horrible footage of a whole 9-story building collapsed. The missile just went from top till the bottom, and I presume hundreds, and not hundreds, people probably are dead under the rubble. And a lot of buildings, residential buildings, have been hit in Kiev. My parents are in Kiev, so I'm quite worried myself. They live centrally, which is supposedly less dangerous, but still, when debris come down and these massive Shahid drones, which are the size of a car, really, they are really dangerous. So Zaporizhia, Odessa, quite a few Ukrainian cities have been hit quite heavily tonight. And the problem is that as we hear, about 20,000 American special rockets, that are anti-drone rockets, have been diverted from Ukraine and sent to Israel and to the Middle East. So Ukraine seems to be actually a victim of this war, in this case, that less protection for Ukrainian air defense, anti-missile defense is happening, and that obviously, very, very difficult to deal with the mega Russians that they have.
And just being very clear, these are civilian targets that the Russians are hitting. They're not military targets in any way, shape, or form.
Absolutely. And despite the obvious fact that they're civilian targets, I've just seen a message on the Russian Ministry of Defense website that clearly shows a 9-story residential building destroyed, and it says, "Targeted attack on military targets. Well done." So even when you see it's a 9-story residential blocks of flats, they claim it's probably NATO headquarters with lots of generals.
Well, yes, but the Russians have got a habit. I think the word is Varanya. You'll probably correct me on that, where it's just telling lies for telling lies' sake, and they know that. But you mentioned the diversion of the missiles. The conflict in the Middle East, the growing conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Iran is having wider implications, not just pushing Ukraine down the importance list on global commentary. Wasn't President Zelensky supposed to meet Donald Trump at the G7 today, but Donald Trump left the G7 early?
Yeah, that's another big setback for Ukraine, because President Zelensky is traveling to Canada, and the meeting was planned with President Trump. President Zelensky was going to ask to sell $500 million worth of weapons for cash from the United States. Obviously, the United States, as you know, is not providing any support to Ukraine anymore in terms of armaments, apart from the remnants of the Biden administration deals. They're even cutting the $300 million annual support that was Ukraine was giving even before the war. So Israel is getting support. Egypt is getting support, although Egypt is not at war with any, as far as I know, any other country at the same levels. But they're cutting these mega $300 million, even from the current budget. That Pete Hegseth has confirmed that. So it is quite a difficult situation, and Ukrainian troops feel, I wouldn't say they feel abandoned, but they do feel alone. And I hear my relatives on the front line saying we just have, we have to rely on our own, whatever we have. And therefore, I think every day that Ukraine is losing support, every day internally, the conversation is going towards development of nuclear weapons. And I'm afraid this is inevitable, that Ukraine will start to probably try to develop it as soon as possible, given that the Western partners are abandoning Ukraine, and European leaders are not providing enough.
Well, of course, it was Ukrainian scientists that during Soviet times helped develop the Russian Soviet nuclear weapons, or the Russian Soviet, the Soviet nuclear weapons. And it was Ukrainian scientists that helped develop a lot of the rocket technology and everything else. So the expertise is in Ukraine to create nuclear weapons. With the nuclear power industry that there is, the reactors are of the type that can create certainly enriched uranium. I'm can't remember off the top of my head, and I should know, having studied nuclear science, whether they can produce plutonium as well. But Ukraine has all the wherewithal to bring together the elements of a nuclear warhead and do that. Do you think they're genuinely trying to develop one?
Obviously, it must be very secretive, but I think, yes, for the benefit of the viewers, the Soviet nuclear power stations were actually plutonium producing factories, and electricity was just a byproduct. So all of them was actually a weapon factories rather than electricity factories. Hence, the Chernobyl disaster has shown that. Ukraine still have Khmelnytska nuclear power plant operating in the western part of Ukraine. Zaporizhia is obviously out of question at the moment, but there are still nuclear power stations operating in Ukraine, which are capable of producing plutonium, as you correctly said. I can hear the kind of conversations among the MPs, kind of starting mentioning nuclear option much more often than before. So I presume this is really a no-brainer.
But then it was the Budapest Agreement that the UK, the United States, and Russia signed up to whenever Ukraine gave up its old Soviet nuclear weapons, to guarantee the security and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And Russia clearly broke it 3 years ago when they carried out their full-scale invasion. They broke it in 2014 whenever they invaded Crimea and stimulated the rebellions in elements in the east. But clearly, with America's withdrawing its support now, it is not meeting up to those international agreements. Is that why you think Ukraine is going, we may as well get nuclear warheads back again, because it will allow us to negotiate for peace on our terms?
I think so. The side irony is that those missiles and those strategic bombers that Russians are using now to hit Kiev are Ukrainian strategic bombers and Ukrainian missiles that they gave up in 1994, and it was transferred to Russia because Bill Clinton was a big fan of President Yeltsin, and we know Bill Clinton has recently apologized and said that was a strategic mistake to push Ukraine to denuclearize. So he went public with a big apology, and therefore I think it is probably one of the options, given that NATO membership has been ruled out by President Trump, and therefore no other serious security guarantee can be provided to Ukraine. In addition to US and UK that signed the Budapest memorandum with Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan, of course, those two countries also gave up nuclear weapons. China and France had a separate memorandum of support. Not the same level, but also China and France have supported denuclearization or unilateral nuclear disarmament of Ukraine in 1994. So those countries also have certain level of responsibility. And I think President Macron has mentioned that once or twice.
Well, UK and France are standing up for Ukraine, and we've heard both leaders of the countries say that they're there to the end. Hopefully, that'll give the level of support. But again, what's going on in the Middle East? I saw in Russian newspapers on Monday, they were saying how Russia's benefiting from the crisis in the Middle East because for two real reasons. One, it's distracting the international community from Russia, Ukraine. But the second thing is that it's impacting global oil prices, and with oil prices going up, that only plays into President Putin's hands, has been able to sell Russian oil for a higher price and give him better returns to help finance his conflict. Are you seeing that from an economic perspective?
Yeah, so the oil prices went up for about $60 a barrel of Brent crude to about 75 now. It's still not the same hike as happened in February 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. I think the oil prices went 30% up back then. So it's still kind of a normal volatility, not a total crisis volatility. But obviously, with the Iranian regime feeling under pressure, we don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of days. They might start hitting oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, Oman, UAE, and that will probably create quite enormous havoc. The European Union and the UK are discussing a new level of sanctions on Russian oil to decrease the price cap, which is currently $60 per barrel, to decrease it to 40. But as we know, the Americans are supposed to be hitting Russians with sanctions now. As we know, nothing is happening because Donald Trump gave Putin 2 weeks to decide, and nothing has happened in terms of the ceasefire or any negotiations, and they're not doing anything else. So that is quite a worrying situation.
I don't think Donald Trump defined which 2 weeks it was. Maybe it's 2 weeks sometime in 2026 or 2027. But you mentioned the EU piece there. Again, in the Russian newspapers on Monday, there was a quote which said, "It's up to us, i.e. the Russians, to deal with Kyiv and to deal with the EU too, because they won't leave us in peace." Should we be worried? And could this be almost a tactic by Donald Trump to undermine the EU, because he sees the EU as an economic competitor? So forcing the EU to step up and spend so much more on defense to deal with the Russian threat and all the rest of it is reducing the EU's economic power to deal with the United States on a trade perspective across the world. Could that be that sort of flawed thinking out of Trump?
I think you're right. The last telephone conversation between Putin and Trump didn't even have a readout. There's no official information what happened, what was said. We only know what Putin's aide said was said, and allegedly they were discussing Iran, but we don't know what kind of conversation they're having. And of course, Trump's crazy economic war on the West is, the EU is definitely one of the potential victims of that. Yesterday they've signed kind of a trade deal with UK, which is kind of the same one they did before, and that's the only thing that the President Trump brought back from Canada, the G7. But also he had the most horrible comments about G7, right? That we need to put Putin back, and if Putin will be here, we wouldn't have a war. Although he forgot why Putin isn't in the G7 anymore, right, or G8. So it looks like the Mad King is getting madder, and that's my current reading of this.
Yeah, well, in that comment where he turned around and said, there wouldn't be a war if Putin had been kept in the G8, as it was, as you say. But he also said that Putin is deeply insulted by having been thrown out from that perspective. And then Trump turned around and said, "And I would be too." And Trump then goes on to say, I can tell you that he hasn't forgotten. So clearly, Putin and Trump have had this sort of conversation, or Donald Trump is making it up. But what do you think the motivation is behind Donald Trump continuing to back Vladimir Putin in the way that he's doing it?
I think we had so many different conspiracy theories, but no Russian spy would be behaving the same way as Donald Trump is behaving. I suspect the Russian spy would be a bit more clever. I just can't see how an asset would be behaving this way, totally supporting and I cannot really believe that they're still trying to play this reverse Nixon crazy idea that they're going to bring Putin back from China and try to kind of distort that relationship. I don't think they can believe in this because it's total nonsense and it definitely cannot happen.
Do you think Putin will be concerned about the randomness of Donald Trump? He's enjoying as much support as he can get, but do you think in the back of his mind he'll be concerned that Trump could turn on him very quickly indeed because he can't predict where he's going to go?
Well, I think they're probably looking at the situation closely. What is going to happen to the supreme leader of Iran? Because there is this widely held belief that there is a pact amongst world leaders not to kill each other, not to assassinate world leaders.
I think it's illegal under international law to deliberately target the leader of a country that you're in conflict with, and that's probably the reason why Benjamin Netanyahu has been told not to target the Grand Ayatollah, albeit the Grand Ayatollah or the president that is in charge of Iran. We know the reality. But who counts as that leader under international law?
I suspect they're looking at that very closely, given that paranoia obviously rules the Kremlin, and the really targeted attacks by the Israel on all the leadership, military leadership of Iran, getting them in their bathrooms. I think that's probably must be worrying Kremlin, given that Ukrainians have been quite successful in hitting strategic nuclear bomber fleet of Russia.
Well, I also find it interesting that Mossad had smuggled elements of drones into Iran that they assembled and then used those drones to attack Iranian airfields. And I think we've heard about that. We had Operation Spider's Web in Ukraine that seemed to come in. But Russia had a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with Iran over support for Russia's war with Ukraine. Do you think that's dead now? And what do you think the impact will be on the things that Russia is getting from Iran to help support its actions into Ukraine, in particular the knowledge behind the Shahed 136 drones? But I suspect there's also components and other things that are still coming from Iran to help Russia assemble them inside Russia. Do you think we're going to see a bit of an impact on that?
That definitely will happen. The impact will be in Ukraine's favor because obviously Iranians will not be able to supply Shahid drones to Russia or help to produce them. Or also we've heard that they were also supplying missiles, ballistic missiles, for testing in Russia that never been used so far, but obviously will never be used now, given that Iran needs those ballistic missiles themselves, or at least for now. And given that Israel is hitting all these factories of drone producing factories in Iran, I think that's probably a positive for Ukraine, given that Iran definitely will not be able to support Russian effort. The difference between the strategic partnership between Iran and Russia from North Korea one is that in the North Korean-Russian partnership also has a stipulation of troop support. So if North Korea is attacked, Russia is supposed to send troops, and if Russia is attacked, North Koreans obviously have sent troops to fight in Ukraine. The Iranian-Russian deal doesn't have that proviso. So no Iranians in Russia or no Russians in Ukraine, in Iran. It's not as really strategic as the North Korean one. But definitely it's quite a big hit on Iran, given that Syria is gone. So Iran is next. So Russia is losing all the Middle Eastern assets that they've had so far. And that is having quite a big impact on the morale of the Russian, the fascist bloggers and all the kind of Z bloggers, because they see this mighty state has been dismantled with very precise attacks.
Certainly, a lot of the oligarchs that underpin the politics that there is in Russia rely on and have relied for many years on their influence within the Middle East, and then that influence in the Middle East acting as a bridge into influence in Africa and other places where they make their billions of dollars through illicit trade and other things. Do you think that pressure that's coming in as they lose that Middle East support base where they were making lots of money is going to put additional pressure politically from the oligarchs inside Russia on Vladimir Putin to start to do something? And is there anything that he can do?
Potentially, yes. And lots of them moved to Dubai in 2022, as we know, or Israel, and now they are obviously in a war zone. I think the Russian leader will have quite a serious decision to make in the autumn when the Russian offensive the last offensive potentially fails to deliver on various geostrategic aims, and Putin will have then to decide whether to call it a day or to escalate. And the escalation probably will require a mobilization of troops, not just buying people with a lot of payouts, but to mobilize it for free. They only done it once in October 2022. If you remember, 300,000 people were mobilized, and they're still, well, if those who are alive are still there. And also recently, the Russian, probably most infamous Russian oligarch, Malafeyev, had hosted a 2-day extravaganza in Russia called Future Russia 2050 Forum, inviting gorgeous George Galloway and various other lunatics to that event. Dugin, the father of Elon Musk, was the biggest hit. And a few other kind of renegades from Western politics. And the manifesto they produced, Russia 2050, calls for the centralized economy. Obviously, the movement of the Orthodox Patriarch from Constantinople to Moscow, mobilization, and it's a kind of a proper fascist kind of theocratic religious state. So I think in October Putin will have kind of an option either to de-escalate and go for a ceasefire, or then to go proper fascist.
Okay, so October we'll put that in the diary. The other silent partner that there seems to be at the moment is China. China's given tacit support to Russia, but it seems to be sitting on the fence very much so. Militarily, economically, and all the rest of it, playing a longer game. What do you think China's getting out of this? Its interactions got with Russia, and in particular, providing support for Russia's war in Ukraine.
Well, we know that Chinese leadership is quite keen to reconfigure international order, right? And to put China up front, and therefore it's using presumably Russia as a kind of icebreaker or a battering ram to hit the West, and to obviously create also a division between Europe and the US. So decoupling Europe from US is a Cold War, right? Dream of the Soviets, and I presume the same dreams Beijing have. So they're getting quite a lot of positives out of that relationship. They're getting obviously a vassal state with unlimited supplies of hydrocarbons. They're even not able to consume all of those gas and oil supplies that Russia is capable of producing and supplying. So they're getting quite a lot of natural resources, and they're getting, I think, most importantly, the geostrategic plus is that Russia is hitting West quite hard.
So at a strategic level, Russia has lost in its war with Ukraine because it's failed to overthrow the Zelensky government, and it's failed to stop NATO from growing. But from a grand strategic perspective, Russia and China are winning because they've created that massive split between the United States and the EU, and they're exploiting that for their own interests around the world. What an interesting thought. Am I in the right ballpark?
Yes, I mean, obviously they didn't create Donald Trump, right? They didn't create MAGA movement, but they're quite carefully exploiting that particular polarization in U.S. politics,
and they'll have been watching it grow for years,
and also supporting that through social media campaigns, as we know in 2016 during Trump's first election. How they carefully the Russia Today and all of the other. The Russia Today is now currently the richest broadcasting corporation in the world. They're getting billions and billions of funding, and Margarita Simonyan is the boss of it. So obviously those money are producing some level of support, given that they have multi-language channels, and as BBC is cutting its own provision of foreign language production, and BBC World is cut, has been cut as we hear now. Russia is actually filling those that void, and now Radio Free, Voice of America is gone. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has been cut. So effectively, all the Western soft power broadcasting has been in decline, whereas the CCTV 13 and all the Chinese television is being supported quite well, funded quite well.
Well, it's interesting. An old American intelligence colleague of mine who used to work for me in a past existence. I was talking to him on the phone last year, and he was saying he watches Russia Today all of the time because he likes it, and that is his first choice of news channel, which is really quite worrying because he lives in the United States. But again, if we look at what's going on geopolitically, do you think the EU, Europe, coalition of the willing, whatever we want to describe it, has A, the political drive, and B, the economic and political wherewithal to step up and maintain the levels of support that Ukraine needs in its fight against Russia's illegal invasion, now that the United States seems to be not just stepping back, but almost running backwards?
Well, I think the coalition of the willing would have been stronger if the UK would have been in the EU, obviously, given that they'll be sitting at the same table, not different tables. The positive noises from Berlin are promising, right? The new chancellor is quite keen on getting on board and getting kind of some sort of leadership, getting some leadership out of President Macron, and probably that is good, given that Germans are serious about rearmament and changing their defense posture. So that's a plus. It's very slow, Philip. Yes, everything is very slow. We're already almost 4 years into the war, 3.5 years, and we're still discussing stuff that should have been done 3 years ago, or even prior to that. So Europe seems to be moving really, really slow, and I'm really concerned about that, given that the Russians are, pressing on the front line.
So come on, I'm going to recruit you now. You're a special advisor to the EU and to the UK Prime Minister. What recommendations would you be making to say how best to deal with Russia and to have the quickest results? And what would they be?
Well, I think Ukraine needs to have frontline support, and that requires air force, right? That requires not just a couple of F-16s or a couple of Mirage fighter jets, but it requires more air support. And I would presume, ideally, you would need to have Western pilots flying those jets, given that there are a lot of Western pilots, and some of them will be willing to volunteer for that mission. So I think hundreds and hundreds of fighter jets and bombers would be probably the best thing, which is not as escalatory as some other potential weapon systems, but that will probably be quite an enormous help for frontline troops, because they've been bombarded every day with these enormous, 1-ton bombs.
Yeah, the glide bombs that they're using.
Glide bombs, half a ton of glide bombs, and thousands and thousands are dropping on the trenches, destroying everything, and that definitely can be stopped by Western jets.
Well, interesting. So, at the moment, can you see any light at the end of the war tunnel, or do you think we're still going to be talking about this time next year?
Well, we'll definitely be talking about this in October, or late autumn. But I think in late autumn, a major decision will need to happen in Moscow, whether they will continue with the war, but that needs a very different war machine. That would require mobilization, that would require really nationalization of all the industries, that would require war economy, that would require, confiscation of all the oligarchs' wealth, that would require potential confiscation of Russian savings. So they do have a lot of money, but they're still private.
But is Putin in that desperate a position where he's going to have to seriously consider all of that?
I think so. I think by October they will be considering that, given that there is more and more voices into that direction from pro-war party, and there are still quite a lot of people enjoying the war because they're benefiting from it tremendously, right? So I think the situation is getting more and more serious for the Russian economy, and by October they will have to decide. I think they won't be able just to muddle through as they're doing now.
Well, having October in the diary and looking at that, I'm sure we're going to get lots of opportunity to explore that and refine it as we get closer. We'll get down to naming the day and the time that Vladimir Putin has to sit down and have those serious conversations. But Vlad, many thanks for chatting with me today on Frontline.
Thank you, Philip. Thanks a lot.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.